the seriousness of the problem we've got. We have a cancer close to the presidency that's growing. It's growing daily. There's the problem of the continued blackmail, which will not only go on now, it'll go on when these people are in prison, and it will compound the obstruction of justice situation. But there's no denying the fact that the White House and Ehrlichman, Hallam, and Dean are involved in some of the early money decisions. I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years.
What I mean is, you can get $1 million, and you can get it in cash. I know where it can be gotten. I mean, it's not easy, but it can be done. But the question is, who the hell?
All right, well, thanks to everybody for coming. This newspaper, which I had printed for the show, goes some way to explaining what you'll see around you in these galleries. And then what I'm going to show you here on the screen will add to it, I think. So, I'm 12 years old, and I'm sitting in the back of the family Chrysler, and we're traveling from California to Maryland. And my mother looks over, we're in the back seat, and she's just appalled by what I'm reading. A Sergeant Rock comic book. And she wasn't seeing the content, because this particular one was actually a fairly strong anti-war story. What she was seeing was that I was reading one of those dreaded comic books. And that was a very despised medium at that time, not like now. You see, my mom, Naomi, she was a young mother in the mid-1950s, and this was a time when the United States Senate was looking into the terrible effects that comic books were supposedly having on the nation's youth. To make a very long story short, there was a handful of cultural crusaders who nearly put a really massive pop culture industry out of business. Hearings were held by a U.S. Senate subcommittee that was inquiring into the topic of juvenile delinquency. And these hearings took place in 1954 downtown at the federal courthouse on Foley Square, because New York City was kind of the center of the comic book industry. And it was headed by a senator who, no surprise, was running for president. So this whole kind of alarm about comic books was started by a New York City psychiatrist whose name was Frederick Wortham. And he wrote a book titled Seduction of the Innocent. And it purported to be this scientific inquiry into the effects of crime and horror comics on children. But actually, it was more based on anecdotes of some of the hardest cases that were in his public health practice. Because he basically said, kids who commit crimes read comic books, which would be analogous to saying nowadays, kids who commit crimes watch television or play video games. That's how pervasive comic books were at that time. And it was in large part due to his crusade that there were even a few comic book burnings across the United States in the late 40s and early 50s. Now, one witness before the committee was William Gaines, and he testified, "I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I am responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste." Well, the senators, none of them shared his taste, and they basically stated that comic publishers were devoid of morality and said, quote, they didn't care what they dish out to these youngsters as long as it sells. So a huge chunk of the industry went under by the end of the year, and this was because the publishers adopted a very rigid, self-censoring set of guidelines that was called the Comics Code, which basically prohibited any hints of sex or violence or any of the salacious stuff that generally makes pop culture popular. So, other than the funny animals that were aimed at kids, the funny animal comics, the bulk of comics that remained on the stands in the late 1950s were pretty much neutered superheroes who looked even more ridiculous than ever now in their long underwear. Now, Gaines himself was left, because he printed Vault of Horror, Crypt of Terror. He really did make his living off of these comics. So he was pretty much left with only one comic book, which was called Mad, which, out of desperation, he turned into a black and white magazine to avoid the strictures of the distribution code. And because of that, his career skyrocketed. Mad magazine became one of the biggest publishing successes of the 20th century. By the early 1970s, my mom was tolerating my reading of Mad magazine, but just barely. This was partly due because the culture itself was changing, and you can see that in this image, where Gaines is testifying about horror comics in 1954, and 16 years later, in 1970, he's a guest on the television show To Tell the Truth, and they're trying to figure out who he is, and it turns out, oh, he's the publisher of Mad magazine. So, a few years later, it was fortunate that my mom didn't know I graduated beyond Mad, and I was now ordering underground comics through the mail. You know, myself, I was worried that the FBI was going to kick down my door because I was 14, 13, I was signing mail order statements swearing that I was 21 years of age or older in order to buy these comics. And they were just full of graphic sex and violence. And they were drawn by guys who had grown up on the 50s crime and horror comics that had been forced out of business a decade earlier. So they no longer had an outlet, and it's a classic case of watch what you wish for. Now, there were a number of underground artists who really impressed me, but one in particular, Vaughn Bodie, was a stone-cold genius, and he spelunked his own id and drew scenes of incredible violence, but with the charm of a Disney animator. Although his style was very over-the-top, cartoony, it was underpinned by super accurate body language. Now, anyone who wants to discuss Bodie's more outrageous stuff, just come see me after the talk. But it should be noted that Bodie considered himself, quote, the cartoon messiah, unquote. And he died in 1975 of autoerotic asphyxiation. It was an accident. And he was age 33, which was also the age that Jesus Christ died at. But his work lives on in tons of reprints, and also he's been in vogue with graffiti artists ever since his early underground days. And you can see his most popular character there on the right, Cheech Wizard, on this Bronx-bound train. And that's why, if you look at that distribution box back there, both Bodie and Cheech Wizard have kind of pride of place on my own little piece of urban landscape, that newspaper distribution box. See, I've always loved the printed page. The more outrageous and garish, the better. And when I was a kid in the Bay Area, my brother, Jim, who's sitting over there, he used to buy copies of the Berkeley Barb. So I'm like 10 years old and I'm seeing these covers and how concerned the look on my mom's face is. And it made me realize this must be really cool stuff. So a few years later, I'm in Baltimore, and my junior high class goes to the Baltimore Museum of Art. And I was astounded to discover that this Ellsworth Kelly was considered good enough to hang in a museum. And again, I just love these bold colors and the direct composition. And in fact, it reminded me of something else that I enjoyed back then, and it still fascinates me to this day, and that's lava lamps, which if you go in the very back, you'll see some of them, because their unexpected shape-shifting always struck me as akin to abstract painting. So I call it painting by other means. And like I say, you can see it in the back gallery. And this was another artwork that was also hanging in the Baltimore Museum that really blew me away. And I can just tell you, it also impressed Jeff Koons, who was a student at the Merrill Institute before I was, but when he was there, and that's a story for another time. But just suffice to say that Robert Rauschenberg's Canyon, this is an astounding painting, a true masterpiece. And it was seeing works like these when I was a teenager that caused me to fall in love with painting. And this was also around the time I started reading about events in the quote-unquote art world. such as the scandal that erupted in Australia when the Labour government there spent a record $1.3 million on Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, which had been painted in 1952. Now, although this painting is one of the biggest draws for both Australians and tourists at Australia's National Gallery, it was reviled by conservatives when it first was brought to the country in 1973. And in fact, members of what you might call the Australian Tea Party have long agitated for its sale to help with the national debt. I just thought at the time, wow, this is cool that a painting could cause this much trouble. And it's not a political painting in any understood sense of the term, and yet it was causing this fierce political discussion about the use of public resources in a democracy. So a few years later, I'm at art school, and I'm at the Maryland Institute, and I've got a really brilliant life drawing teacher who's encouraging me to copy the compositions of the old masters, because I was just enthralled with painting of all kinds. But as we all know, school can only last so long, and then you need to get a job. So, having a bachelor's of fine arts, I got a job loading trucks for the United Parcel Service. But it was just a great job for a painter. We can talk about that too afterwards. But it was my second job out of art school, that combined my love of the printed page with my love of painting. And I got a job pasting up ads at the Village Voice, which is that rare sort of place where you can start out in the production department and end up publishing cover stories. And it was also around this time that I got the idea, it was just the idea itself of the copy really began to intrigue me. Not just hand-drawn copies of the masters, but mass-produced copies. I was really becoming fascinated with the ways that mechanical reproduction works to produce these really powerful images, the ones I'd grown up loving. And that aesthetic of the copy became as important to me as the images themselves. Now, I have to say, this isn't a wildly original idea, but it was Warhol and other great painters who taught me that color and form and composition and volume and narrative and illusion, that everything's up for grabs. And in addition to the expansiveness that I found in paintings such as De Chirico's perspectives and Guston's the menace of his cartoon figures, I was also learning, when I became the press check guy for the Village Voice, who oversaw the printing of the Voice, about all the ways that images are prepared for high-speed commercial reproduction. I was still doing paste up and writing freelance articles when I started doing press checks. The production manager came up to me and said, "You're a painter. You know what cyan, magenta, yellow, and black are, right?" And I said, "Sure, the first three were primary colors, but I knew them better as blue, red, and yellow." And she said, "Good, you're doing our press checks from now on." So you can go into an art store and see hundreds, if not thousands, of different colors of paint. But a commercial printer knows basically four colors, all of which you can see in this enlargement: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. CMYK. And yes, it is K for black. And again, if anybody has a question, you can talk to me after the talk. That such a broad and exciting color gamut could come from such a simple palette just quite frankly humbled me as a painter. And another aspect of printing that astonished me were the occasional mistakes and accidents. So you get a solvent spill or an ink drip, and all an image such as this one needs, and I pulled it off the press real quick before it went into the recycle dumpster, all it needs is a title. In this series of images I call Jornada del Muerto, after a section of the New Mexico desert near where the very first atomic bomb was detonated in 1945. Now I have to tell you, when it comes to printing a newspaper, don't ever try and get just 1,000 copies printed, because a commercial printer will throw away that many copies just to get the presses up and rolling. Get them up to speed so that the inks in the register are starting to get close. So when I decided to print a tabloid newspaper as part of this show, I knew that I probably wouldn't want to go with any of the huge operations that printed the Voice because it would be too expensive simply because they couldn't deal with such a small scale. It would just be out of their wheelhouse. So I contacted someone I knew at a more down-market printer in Queens, and he agreed to do the job. He agreed until he got a much bigger daily to print that left no window for me. So I suddenly had to change printers 2 weeks before this show was to open. And he recommended a printer who was even farther out in Queens, out by an auto wrecking yard. And he said they might have a print window available. So I spent a lot of time on the phone with these new printers because what I wanted to do was basically turn a standard, what you'd call a broadsheet, sideways. I was literally turning everything 90 degrees to print one of the sections. And so I brought the dummy out to the plant, and it turned out to be a father and son operation. So the father looks at the dummy and he says, "No problem, we'll do it this way." And the son doesn't even look up at his desk. He just says, "That won't work." And the father said, "What are you talking about? Of course it will work." And the son just said, "No, it won't." So I gave the dummy to the son. And I also told them at that time, "Hey, I want the printing plates when the run is finished." And they looked at me like I was crazy. They said they're going to be covered with solvent, they're going to be filled with ink. And I said, "That's fine, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want." So we're now 5 days out from the show installation. And I get a phone call from the son. And he says, "Is it a problem if the poster inserts are in a different page order than you gave us?" "Yeah." And I said, "Send me a picture." So I get an iPhone picture, and I look at it. And because these didn't have page numbers, and this section was just one page after another, and they were all basically the same design, I said, "No, it's not a problem." I said, "Just please don't screw up the tabloid, because that has to be in order." And I said, "And you kept the printing plates for me, right?" And the son says, "The pressmen are digging them out of the pile. That's another thing they didn't listen to me about." So the papers did finally show up on Tuesday afternoon, and so did the plates. You can see them hanging there in that corridor. And the show opened on Thursday. But that's okay because I have never worked on a newspaper that didn't almost miss its deadline. So I'm used to it. And despite that, I truly love mechanical reproduction because I'm fascinated by the way that images move from the real experienced world where through a camera lens you get something like this image from the end of Abraham Zapruder's home movie, The Kennedy Assassination, which is abstractly beautiful until you think of the horror of what it represents. And I came to realize that the world that we have created is at least as interesting as the world that created us. And this is like both the awe-inspiring wonder and the existential curse that we live under, because we're the only thoroughly self-aware beings in the universe as far as we know. And yet we've created this world that we react to. Now, maybe that's heavy freight for cheaply printed comic books, but in my view, you gotta find beauty and take it wherever you can get it. So my observation that the original image degrades each time it moves from one step to the next in the reproduction process, what those are called print generations, is what led me to the posters you see over there in that mural. They're what I call degeneration prints. You see, I blew up those postage stamped images you see in the back there inside that gold frame I found on the street one trash night. And I enlarged them on an old production proofer, which actually didn't work very well, which was exactly what I wanted. And once I enlarged them to tabloid size, then I would make a copy, and then make a copy of that copy, and make a copy of that copy, and make a copy of that copy, so that they continue to, in some regard, degrade, and in other regards, get more and more beautiful. And I was continuously surprised by what came out of the printer, somewhat akin to the way the abstract expressionists would surprise themselves when they started throwing paint at the canvases like Jackson Pollock did. And so in the back room are the larger versions of these prints in their final, most abstract states. And in this video in the corridor, is a stop-motion animation of these posters, morphing from recognizable imagery to abstraction and back again. And I overlaid it with a soundtrack combining sections of the Watergate tapes, which themselves are severely distorted, and another cultural icon, the Rolling Stones. And in both the case of this animation and in the larger posters in the back, I returned those tiny little thumbnails in that original advertisement back to the size of the posters that they were actually advertising, albeit very distorted. So, and then on the far wall, there's another animation, and I call that one the poster rack, because it is a continuous random shuffle of all 3,583 images that make up President Y. So it'd be like going into a head shop with an endless poster rack to go through. Now, if I hadn't read these comics growing up, I probably would have never gone to art school, and probably never got a job pasting up ads, and I wouldn't have been writing for newspapers. But in 2016, in a piece that the editor-in-chief termed The Hookless Wonder because of its complete lack of any kind of newsworthy hook, I wrote about painting and comics and atom bombs and the fragility of art and the tenuousness of civilization and many other things. It was sort of a memoir instigated by my taking part in a collaboration with the witty German conceptual artist Christian Jankowski. The concept was for critics to write a review of Jankowski's show before anyone saw it. This critique was then rolled up and stuffed inside a bottle, unread by anyone but me, in my case, and my wife Laura, who edits everything I write. But then Jankowski would get it, he would not read it, he would simply seal the bottle with wax. And my reviewing bottle and those of about 100 other arts writers then made up Jankowski's exhibition, which is titled Review. Now, Jankowski let it be known that anyone who revealed what had been written would have his or her bottle removed from the series. So when I wrote my article for The Voice a few years later, I raised the question in that article of whether or not this was a unique memoir or simply a repetition of what I had put into the bottle. Now, I'm not saying, and I never will, but there is a copy of what I did write for Jankowski inside an identical Gallo bottle that's in the Village Voice distribution box in the back room, the one that's adorned with a painting by some unknown street artist. Now, this artist whoever he or she was, intended the work to be hidden on the bottom of the box, facing the sidewalk. It was revealed in 2015 when the Voice's distributor discovered it and sent it to our offices. The artwork is a little like a message in a bottle. Maybe one day it would be found, maybe not. But someone did, and yet it remains a mystery. It's a treasure without a map. So in my 3 decades plus of working at the Voice, I caught all kinds of errors before they got to the printer. Wrong information in ads, misspellings in the headlines, factual errors in articles, and once we had gotten the wrong birth date for Adolf Hitler. And the folks who advertised the annual parade promoting the legalization of pot, 2 years running, sent in the wrong date. In case you're curious, both Hitler's birthday and International Pot Day are April 20th. So when we finalized the pages for the last print issue of The Voice, I missed that the dates of my employment, which ran from 1987 to the present, were incorrect. And for some reason, the start date had gone into the paper as 1984, and I missed it. Perhaps because subconsciously I just felt like 1984 was a more auspicious year than 87. But it doesn't matter, you can change it in print, so there you go. But back in 1967, when he received the proof for his seminal book, The Medium is the Message, Marshall McLuhan laughed when he saw that the typesetter had made a big mistake and changed message to massage. Supposedly McLuhan said, "Leave it alone, it's great and it's right on target." He liked it so much that he also used it for the name of an album that he put out shortly after the book. Now, a man of flexible mind who really appreciated serendipity McLuhan realized that the fast-evolving mediums of his time, which included radio, television, the telephone, and the computer in the nascent forms of electronic communication that we take for granted today, did indeed massage us. And at times, I think we all appreciate this, it made us numb. Now, comics, if you listen to the Crusaders in the 1950s, were the medium that were numbing America's youth, turning them into antisocial zombies. And perhaps I avoided this fate because even before I knew how comics were printed, I was fascinated by the mechanically applied dots. And I was always curious when I found a page where the printing dots were way out of register, because I knew something was wrong, but I also thought it was really beautiful. And in this image, you can see why I was a very lousy comic book collector. Some years ago, one of the times I needed money, I sold my comic book collection to a pair of dealers at a fan convention. And I realized one of my most valuable items, Blazing Combat #1, a comic magazine with a cover by the legendary Frank Frazetta, was at the Voice offices. So the dealers held back the $50 we agreed on for that particular book. So I mailed it to them a couple days later, and I waited for my check. And after 3 weeks, I called one of the guys. I said, "Hey, did you get that Blazing Combat #1? Did it get there in good condition?" And he said, "Yep." I said, "Well, good. Where's my money?" And he says, "You're going to have to call my partner. He says there's pages missing from the books you sold us." I said, "That's bullshit. Give me his number." So he gives me the number. I start dialing it, and then I put the phone down because I realized that, yes, there were pages missing in the 500 or so books I sold, probably a lot of them. Because you see, when I was a kid, I didn't collect comics. I collected artists. For instance, I really loved how Neil Adams drew. So I tried to get a hold of anything he worked on, and it didn't matter if it was a mystery anthology or a war comic or a superhero title or a Ben Casey Sunday comic strip. I just bought anything I could find that he drew. And whenever there were back-to-back ads in the comic books that continued on third page following line, whenever I saw that, I would tear the ads out of the book so that it would no longer interrupt the flow of the artwork, which is nice for the art, but terrible for collectability. So that was a very bad collector's habit. But I think my intense looking at the comics form prepared me for art school, because that's where I began to see connections between so-called high and low art, both concerned with ideas of dynamism, color, composition, content, narrative, abstraction. And all these things seemed obvious to me, even though they weren't necessarily evident to my teachers or my peers. And it remains somewhat that way to this day. So I'll leave you with this. There's always a starting point, and then, like it or not, things end. Hopefully somewhere in the ballpark where we want them to. But as they used to say in the 60s, and I believe it more wholeheartedly now than ever, it's not the destination, it's the journey. So, thank you.